The year was 1887, and the silence in Dr. Arthur Weston's house was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence that had long ago settled into the floorboards and clung to the curtains like dust. It had been 2 years since the silence had first arrived, a cruel house guest in the wake of his wife Eleanor's passing, and it had never left. His home, which also served as his small clinic on the outskirts of Prairie Ridge, was an outpost of solitude, surrounded by a vast, indifferent expanse of Montana land that rolled toward the jagged teeth of the distant mountains. Winter had come early, burying the world in a pristine, merciless white that mirrored the frozen landscape of his own heart. Arthur was a man hollowed out by grief. At 40, his hair was prematurely flecked with gray, and his face, once animated by a quiet intellectual curiosity, had settled into a permanent mask of weary resignation. He performed his duties as the town's only doctor with a detached competence. He set bones, stitched wounds, and dispensed laudanum for pains both physical and spiritual, but his movements were mechanical, his eyes holding a distance that discouraged conversation beyond the clinical. The man he had been, the husband who had loved Eleanor's laughter, the doctor who believed in healing not just the body, but the spirit, had died with her. What remained was a shell, animated by little more than memory and routine. The routine was his only shield against the crushing weight of the silence. Mornings were for reviewing his medical journals, the crisp turn of a page, the loudest sound in the house. Afternoons were for patience, if any braved the journey to his door. Evenings were the hardest. They were for staring out the window as the sky bruised into nightfall, watching the snow-laden pines become black silhouettes against a sea of stars. It was in these hours that the memory always returned, sharp and undulled by time. It was the memory of a different road, 2 years prior. The lurch of the stagecoach, the sudden, terrifying shout, a figure in the road, masked and holding a pistol with an unnerving stillness. The air had crackled with a cold authority. He remembered Eleanor's hand clutching his, her knuckles white. He had tried to be brave for her, to shield her. The outlaw's voice had been the most unsettling part, low and clear, strangely devoid of the coarse gravel he'd have expected. It was controlled, almost melodic in its command. The strongbox, and your valuables, quickly. There was no room for negotiation. He remembered the glint of the pistol's barrel, the dark void of the mask's eye-holes. He had handed over his wallet, Eleanor, her small pearl earrings. The entire ordeal lasted no more than 5 minutes, but the terror of it had seeped into Eleanor's fragile constitution. She had been prone to bouts of lung fever, and the chilling fear of that day, the lingering shock, had weakened her defenses. A month later, a fever took hold and never let go. Arthur, the doctor who could save strangers, had been helpless to save his own wife. The outlaw had not fired a shot, yet had killed her as surely as if they had. Now, he lived with that memory, with the ghost of his wife and the specter of a faceless, nameless thief. He had built his fortress of solitude, and he intended to live out his days within its walls, disturbed by nothing and no one. But the land, like life itself, was not given to honoring such intentions. The knock on the door was frantic, a violent assault on the house's profound quiet. It was well past midnight, and a blizzard was savaging the landscape, the wind howling like a thing grieving. Arthur pulled on his robe, his initial irritation giving way to the familiar sense of professional duty. He opened the door to a blast of ice and snow, and the spectral figure of a young ranch hand from the McBride place, his face raw from the wind. "Dr. Weston," the boy gasped, his words torn away by the gale. "The stage. It went off the road down in Miller's Ravine. The storm, it's gone." A cold dread, separate from the freezing air, settled deep in Arthur's bones. He dressed quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, grabbing his heavy coat and the worn leather medical bag that was an extension of his own arm. The ride to the ravine was a treacherous battle against the elements. The wind drove the snow into a blinding curtain, and the world was reduced to the small, bobbing circle of light from his lantern. The scene at the bottom of the ravine was a tableau of chaos and death. The stagecoach lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its wheels pointing uselessly toward the tumultuous sky. The driver and the other two passengers, a well-dressed man from back east and a local prospector, were gone, their bodies broken by the fall. He checked them all, a grim and futile exercise against the brutal finality of their injuries. It was as he was about to give up, to surrender to the storm and the tragedy, that his lantern light caught something. A flash of pale skin against the dark, snow-dusted upholstery inside the wrecked coach. Partially buried under a pile of luggage and splintered wood was a woman. Her face was a mess of bruises and cuts, one side swollen and purpled, but even through the blood and the grime, he could see she was beautiful. Long, dark hair was fanned out in the snow, like spilled ink. He felt for a pulse at her neck, his fingers numb with cold. It was there, faint, thready, but undeniably present. A flicker of life in a gallery of death. There was a deep gash on her temple, the source of most of the bleeding. A severe head injury, he diagnosed instantly. She was unconscious, lost to the world. He searched her pockets and her simple reticule for some form of identification, but found nothing, no name, no destination. She was a ghost, delivered to him by the storm. Getting her out of the wreckage and onto his horse was a Herculean task that left him gasping for breath, his muscles screaming in protest. The ride back was a slow, perilous journey, with Arthur holding her limp body in front of him, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own. The unconscious weight of her in his arms was a strange and unsettling feeling. It had been so long since he had held anyone. He had brought a stranger into his fortress, and as he laid her down on the patient bed in his clinic room, the silence of the house seemed to recede, pushed back by the sound of her shallow breathing. His world, so carefully ordered in its misery, had just been irrevocably broken. For a week, the woman did not wake. She existed in a deep, silent world between life and death, and Arthur became her sole anchor to the living. The rhythm of his days was no longer his own. It now revolved around her. He cleaned and stitched the gash on her temple with meticulous care. He washed the blood and grime from her face and hands, revealing the fine lines of her features and the unexpected calluses on her palms, and fingers the hands of someone who knew hard work, not a delicate lady of leisure. He sat by her bedside for hours, monitoring her breathing, checking the reactivity of her pupils, forcing spoonfuls of warm broth between her lips. The tasks were clinical, the rote movements of a physician, yet they felt profoundly different. Tending to this nameless woman forced an intimacy upon him, a physical connection that was both unnerving and, to his shame, strangely welcome. He had to turn her every few hours to prevent bed sores, his hands learning the shape of her shoulders, the line of her back. He found himself speaking to her, his voice hoarse from disuse. He would read passages from his medical texts aloud, not for her benefit, but for his own, to hear a human voice in the suffocating quiet. The cranial nerves are a set of 12 paired nerves that arise directly from the brain. He'd murmur, the words sounding absurd in the stillness. Yours have suffered quite a shock, it seems. He was observing her, not just as a doctor assesses a patient, but as a man studies a mystery. Who was she? Where had she come from? What sorrows or joys had drawn the faint lines around her eyes? In her unconsciousness, she was a blank canvas, and he found himself projecting a narrative onto herowoman fleeing a difficult past, perhaps seeking a new start. He felt an rising tide of protectiveness, a fierce, primal need to keep this fragile life from slipping away. She was his patient, his responsibility. It was a purpose, and he clung to it like a drowning man to a raft. Then, on the 8th day, as the morning sun cast long, pale fingers of light across the room, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly, hesitantly, opened. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, clouded with confusion and pain. She blinked, trying to focus on his face as he leaned over her. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice gentle. "You're safe." Her lips parted, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He helped her sip some water, cradling her head in his hand. The contact was electric, a jolt of life that ran straight through him. Where am I?" she finally whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "You're in my home. I'm a doctor. There was a stagecoach accident," he explained simply, not wanting to overwhelm her. She looked around the room at the whitewashed walls, the shelves of medical books, the window with its view of the snow-covered prairie. There was no flicker of recognition in her gaze, only a profound and terrifying blankness. "An accident," she repeated. She tried to sit up, a soft cry of pain escaping her as her head throbbed. He gently pushed her back down. "You have a serious head injury. You need to rest," he said. He watched her face carefully. "Do you remember your name?" She stared at him, her green eyes wide with a dawning panic. She searched the empty corridors of her mind and found nothing. No name, no past, no home. Tears welled and spilled down her bruised cheeks. "No," she choked out, the word a tiny admission of absolute loss. I don't remember anything." Her amnesia was a wall between her and her past, and in the weeks that followed, Arthur found himself grateful for it. He gave her a name, a simple one to anchor her. "We'll call you Jane for now," he had said, and she had accepted it with a quiet nod. Her vulnerability was absolute. She was a child in a woman's body, relearning the world from the confines of his small house. As her physical strength returned, so did a quiet, resilient spirit. She began to move about the house, her steps still tentative, her hand often going to her temple, where the scar was a pale pink line. They fell into a new routine, a domestic rhythm that felt both strange and deeply natural. He would cook their simple meals, and she would sit at the table, watching him with a silent intensity. Soon, she began to help, her movements growing more confident. She swept the floors, her brow furrowed in concentration. She mended one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat, betraying a familiarity with the task that her mind could not recall. The silence in the house was replaced by the soft sounds of their shared existence, the clink of utensils, the rustle of her dress, the low murmur of their sparse conversations. He found himself talking to her, truly talking, for the first time in 2 years. He told her about the herbs in his garden, now sleeping under the snow. He spoke of the different bird calls that signaled the coming of spring. He never spoke of Eleanor. That part of his past remained a locked room inside him, but other doors were beginning to creak open. She was a calming presence, a quiet listener who seemed to absorb the lonely ache of the house and transform it into something softer. He saw the fear in her eyes slowly recede, replaced by a tentative trust. He would catch her looking at him sometimes, a question in her gaze, and he would offer a small, reassuring smile. He was no longer just her doctor, he was her guardian, her only link to a world she could not remember. The hardened shell around his heart had begun to crack, and through the fissures, a dangerous warmth was beginning to spread. He was coming to care for this woman, this Jane, and the realization frightened him as much as it healed him. The thaw came to the land before it came fully to Arthur's heart. As the snow melted into muddy rivers and the first green shoots pushed through the frozen earth, Clarathwoman he knew as Jane grew stronger. Her memory, however, remained a stubborn blank, save for disturbing, disjointed flashes that would come upon her without warning. The smell of gun oil from his hunting rifle, the feel of worn leather reins in her hands, the image of a dusty road under a relentless sun. These fragments would leave her pale and trembling, her eyes dark with a fear she couldn't name. News of the doctor sheltering a survivor from the winter crash had slowly trickled into Prairie Ridge. The town, a small collection of wooden storefronts and hardy souls, was a place where secrets had a short lifespan. One afternoon, Sheriff Donovan rode out to the house. He was a tall, pragmatic man with a drooping moustache and eyes that missed little. "Arthur," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. His gaze flickered toward Clara, who sat quietly by the hearth, her hands clasped in her lap. "Heard your patient is up and about. That's good news." "She's recovering well," Arthur said, his tone carefully neutral, "but her memory hasn't returned." Donovan grunted, sipping his coffee. "Strange business. We never did identify her. Funny thing is, there's been talk." He lowered his voice slightly. "About that string of stagecoach robberies last year. The Pinkertons believe the Outlaw, a nasty piece of work they call Sea Hale, might have been on that coach. Maybe trying to skip the territory with a big score." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the spring air. He kept his face impassive. "An outlaw? On that stage?" "Just a theory," the sheriff continued, stroking his mustache. "Witness descriptions were always vague. Some said the thief had a slender build, moved fast. A few even swore the voice sounded, well, not like a man's, probably nonsense." He glanced at Clara again, his expression unreadable. "Just keep your eyes open, Arthur. A woman traveling alone with no name. It pays to be careful." After the sheriff left, a seed of poison had been planted in the fragile soil of Arthur's newfound peace. He started watching her. He saw the way her body was poised, a kind of coiled readiness even in repose. He noticed the sharp, assessing way her eyes would sweep over a room. Was the vulnerability he had nursed an elaborate act? Was the amnesia a convenient lie? The memory of the robbery, of that cold, commanding voice, echoed in his mind. He tried to imagine it coming from her lips, but the thought was a dissonance he couldn't resolve. The woman who hummed softly while kneading bread dough could not be the same person who had terrorized him and his wife. His suspicion manifested as a subtle withdrawal. He grew quieter, the easy companionship they had built now, strained with an unspoken tension. Clara felt the shift immediately. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a guarded watchfulness. The air between them grew thick with things unsaid. "Is something wrong, Doctor?" she asked one evening, her voice small. Have I done something to displease you?" "No, of course not, Jane," he answered too quickly, unable to meet her gaze. The lie felt heavy and sour in his mouth. A week later, the seed of doubt grew into a thorny vine. While in town for supplies, he saw it tacked to the sheriff's notice board. A wanted poster, its ink faded by the sun. It offered a reward for information leading to the capture of Sea Hale, responsible for armed robbery. The description was maddeningly general. Slender build, quick, dangerous. But below the text was a sketch, a rendering based on a witness's memory. It was crude, the lines harsh, but it captured something of the shape of a face, the set of a jaw, the intensity of the eyes. It was a distorted, menacing echo of the face he saw every day across his dinner table. His blood ran cold. He ripped the poster from the board when no one was looking, his heart hammering against his ribs. He confronted her that night, not with an accusation, but with the poster itself. He laid it on the table between them, the silence stretching taut. Clara stared at the sketch, her breath catching in her throat. A flicker of something crossed her face, no recognition, but a deep, instinctual horror. They think this might be the person who was on the stagecoach," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "An outlaw." She looked from the drawing to his face, her eyes pleading. You can't think that's me," she whispered, shaking her head. "I could never be that." He wanted to believe her. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to trust the woman he had cared for, the woman who had painstakingly stitched his life back together without even knowing it. But the ghost of Eleanor stood between them, her memory a silent, judging presence. He was torn between the man he was becoming and the man he had been, between the possibility of a future and the unshakable grip of the past. The trigger was something small, mundane. It was a week later, on an evening when a fragile peace had tried to resettle over the house. Arthur was cleaning his medical instruments, the polished steel glinting under the lamplight. Clara was watching him from her chair by the fire when his hand brushed against a silver buckle on his bag. The specific way the light caught the metal, a sudden, sharp flash, was like a key turning a lock in the rusted vault of her mind. A torrent of images flooded her, the jostle of a galloping horse, the rough texture of a canvas mask against her skin, the heavy, familiar weight of a Colt peacemaker in her hand. Faces swam before her eyes, frightened, angry, pleading, and then one face became brutally clear, a man with kind eyes filled with terror, shielding a pale, fragile woman beside him. She saw his face, the face of the doctor who had saved her life, and she recognized him not from the past few months, but from a dusty roadside 2 years ago. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The money from that robbery, the one that had been meant to buy her passage to a new life, to freedom from a past she was desperate to escape. It was his wife, the pale woman. Had she been there? She had. Oh God, she had been there. The name came back to her lips, a bitter taste. Clara. My name is Clara Hale. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Arthur looked up, startled by the sudden noise. He saw her face, ashen and stricken, her green eyes wide with a horror so profound it stole his breath. "Jane," he asked, his voice laced with alarm. "What is it?" She shook her head, a strangled sob caught in her throat. She couldn't live with his kindness for one more second. It was a fire, scorching her from the inside out. She had to extinguish it with the truth. "My name," she began, her voice a raw, broken thing he barely recognized. "It's Clara." She took a shaky step toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Clara Hale." She watched his face, saw the flicker of confusion before the dawning, sickening understanding. 2 years ago, she forced the words out, each one a shard of glass in her throat. "The Stagecoach robbery, outside of this town. The one with your wife." She saw the blood drain from his face, his expression crumbling into a mask of pure agony. "It was me." The confession hung in the air, a monstrous, unbelievable thing. Arthur stared at her, his world tilting on its axis. The woman he had nursed back from the brink of death, the woman whose quiet presence had soothed the raw edges of his grief, the woman he had felt a dangerous, tender affection for, was the monster from his nightmares, the architect of his misery. The voice, the mask, the gunnet was all her. A wave of white-hot rage, cold and potent, surged through him. He saw Eleanor's terrified face, felt the phantom grip of her hand in his. Justice, vengeance sight, was all he could think. He could ride to town, get the sheriff, and let the law do what it must. But then he looked at her, truly looked. He saw past the phantom outlaw and saw Clara, standing before him, utterly broken. Her shoulders were slumped in defeat, and tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the phantom dust of her past. This was not the cold, authoritative figure from his memory. This was a woman drowning in her own guilt, offering him her life as penance. He saw the person who had bathed his brow when a fever took him, the one who had listened patiently to his ramblings about botany, the one whose soft humming had made the house feel like a home again. He saw both people at once, the sinner and the saint, the cause of his pain and the catalyst for his healing, and the conflict nearly tore him in two. A frantic pounding on the door shattered the moment. "Arthur, open up. It's Sheriff Donovan." Clara flinched as if struck. Her eyes, wide with terror, met his. This was it, the end of the line. Arthur's mind raced. He could give her up. It would be easy. It would be just. But as he looked at her terrified face, he knew he couldn't do it. To hand her over to Donovan would be to betray not just her, but the man he had become in the months she had been there. It would mean erasing the flicker of life she had ignited within him and returning to the cold, empty tomb of his grief. It was a choice between the past and the future, between vengeance and something far more complex and terrifying, grace. "The cellar," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Go, now, and do not make a sound." She stared at him, uncomprehending for a second, then nodded, a look of profound, stunned gratitude flashing in her eyes before she turned and disappeared down the narrow stairs, just as the sheriff's fist beat against the door again. Arthur took a deep, steadying breath, composed his features into a familiar mask of somberness, and opened the door. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "a bit late for a house call." "Sorry to bother you, Arthur," Donovan said, stepping inside and shaking the chill from his coat. "Just had a hunch. Been thinking about that Jane Doe of yours. Decided I ought to have a look around, ask her a few more questions myself." Arthur met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "You've missed her, I'm afraid," he said, the lie smooth and practiced. "Her memory started coming back in pieces a few days ago. Enough for her to know she had family in the East. I gave her some money for a ticket. She left on yesterday's morning stage." The sheriff searched Arthur's face, his eyes narrowed in scrutiny. He saw the familiar, tired sadness there, the look of a man once again alone in his quiet house. It was a look he recognized. It was a look he believed. "Is that so?" Donovan finally said, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Well, guess the trail's gone cold for good then." He tipped his hat. "Sorry to have disturbed your evening, Doctor." Arthur watched him ride away until his lantern was just a pinprick of light in the vast darkness. He closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing the finality of his choice. The immediate danger had passed, but the truth now lived between them, a silent, powerful entity in the quiet of the house. After the sheriff was long gone, Clara emerged from the cellar. She looked pale and fragile in the lamplight, her eyes shadowed with the enormity of what had just happened. The air was thick with everything they could not say. There were no apologies that could suffice, no words of forgiveness that could be offered. He had not saved her for her own sake, but for his. Turning her in would have meant a return to the man he was, a man defined solely by his loss. In choosing to protect her, he had chosen to protect the part of himself that had started to heal. Their bond, once built on the gentle fiction of her amnesia, was now reforged in the crucible of a terrible shared truth. They existed in a strange, quiet limbo in the days that followed. The simple domestic routines they had established now carried an impossible weight. When he tended to a small cut on her hand from a kitchen knife, the simple, clinical gesture was laden with the memory of his choice. He was not just a doctor, and she was not just his patient. They were two broken people who had, against all odds, found a strange and complicated solace in one another. But they both knew she could not stay. Her presence was a constant danger to him, a secret that could unravel his life. The wanted poster, though torn from the board, still existed in the memory of the town. Her freedom, and his, depended on her disappearance. He began to make preparations. He gathered money far more than he had told the sheriff and packed a bag with durable food, a compass, and a change of clothes. He mapped out a route for her, one that would take her north into the territories, far from the reach of the law in Montana, where a woman with a haunted past might truly begin anew. Their farewell took place just before dawn on a cool, clear morning. The sky was a soft, pearlescent grey, pregnant with the promise of a new day. He gave her the bag and a sturdy mare from his stable. "This trail will lead you toward the Canadian border," he said, his voice low. "It's not an easy journey, but you are resilient." Clara looked at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Arthur," she whispered, the name a quiet acknowledgement of the man he was, not just the doctor. "There are no words for what you've done. Why?" He looked out at the horizon, at the first blush of pink staining the edge of the world. "When you arrived, this house was a tomb," he said, his voice heavy with a truth he was only just beginning to understand himself. "I was a ghost within it. You brought life back into these rooms. Vengeance, justice. It would have only deepened the silence." He finally met her gaze. "You gave me back a part of myself I thought I had lost forever. Perhaps that is a debt repaid." She mounted the horse, her movements fluid and capable. For a moment, she was the outlaw, a figure of strength and survival. but her expression was one of profound, heartbreaking gratitude. She reached down and her hand briefly, desperately, squeezed his. It was a goodbye, a thank you, and an absolution all at once. Then she turned the horse and rode away, not looking back. Arthur stood in the doorway and watched until she was a small, solitary figure disappearing into the vast, awakening landscape. He was not watching the outlaw who had ruined his life right away. He was watching the woman who had, in the strangest and most painful of ways, saved it. The house was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the hollow, crushing emptiness of grief. It was a peaceful silence, full of reflection and the echo of a profound choice. The air felt lighter, the rooms less oppressive. He stood there for a long time, feeling the cool morning air on his face as the sun finally crested the mountains, bathing the world and him in its clean, forgiving light. For the first time in 2 years, Arthur Weston felt the undeniable stirring of peace.